next guest on stage is joining me for not a presentation, but a conversation. John Graham-Cumming is the CTO of CloudFlare, the website protection and acceleration company that I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room has heard of. He also wrote one of the first Bayesian email filters, PopFile, back in 2002. Here to talk about the next crypto wars and what every host needs to know. Please welcome to the stage, John Graham-Cumming. Thank you very much for joining us.
Welcome.
Do take a seat. So, we're calling it the crypto war. We've heard a lot about this. We've had a lot of people on stage in the night talks talking about it. Why are you defining it as a war? How vicious is this going to get?
So, first of all, I don't think it's actually a war, but if you want to use a war analogy, it's actually a civil war, right? It's a war of people and governments arguing amongst themselves, right? Within any individual country, there's a disagreement about how best to regulate cryptography. Now, the funny thing is, why we're talking about it as a crypto war is we've actually been through this entire argument 22 years ago. So all the arguments you're hearing about terrorism, the need to get access to communications, were run through in 1994, and the Clinton administration, the last one, not the next one, actually decided that the balance was that it was better to have strong cryptography available because there was something called the internet coming, and this would be valuable. So what I say is the big thing that's changed since 1994 is the internet actually arrived, and what looked like a theoretical argument with Al Gore saying, this is going to be important, the information superhighway, that actually happened. And we use cryptography all the time, right? So we're now just replaying the same arguments we heard 20 years ago. And
presumably, given that we have strong encryption now, I guess what folks would define here as the light side of the force won that battle.
Well, I guess if you want to make it seem like it's black and white, I mean, it's not simple, right? This isn't an easy question. That's why it's being debated very hard, because there are legitimate reasons why intelligence agencies want to get access to communications. And sometimes I feel like, a bit like the scene in Casablanca where Captain Renault says, I'm shocked that there's gambling going on in here. Some of the political response about intelligence agencies' behavior seems to be a bit like that, with people saying, I'm shocked to discover that we were spying on people. And that's actually part of the game, right, is that every country has intelligence agencies doing things. I think the good thing that's happening is that the United States, where this, primarily this discussion is happening, has a very strong judicial tradition, and this is actually happening in public, right? We're talking about this in court filings, in public, and I think that's a very healthy thing, and perhaps better even than in '94.
So what can the hosting providers, what can the folks who are in this room watching this, what do you think they're going to be dealing with in a year's time, in 5 years' time, when hopefully this has started to resolve?
So I think that what is going to happen is that however this gets resolved, there will be the need to manage cryptographic keys, and that will be the most important part of this, because when you think about cryptography, when you go back to '94, there were arguments about whether people should even be allowed to know about strong cryptography. Right? Now, all the strong cryptographic algorithms are out there. We're using them all the time. There's open source software. That genie is out of the lamp, right, and is doing things. So then you have to move on and say, okay, well, how do you regulate or control cryptography? And it all comes down to key management. So there's going to be some sort of agreement about how we do that. Now, it may be that the next administration in the US says, just like the Clinton administration did, we think the balance is that it's okay for people to have what's called end-to-end encryption, which is i.e. we can't get the key, because there is a greater good, right? And there are these bad examples, but there's a greater good from the economy and for people having privacy, etc. The other extreme is the government says, no, we should always be able to get hold of cryptographic information, in which case what that really will probably mean is service provider or some escrow agency has to hang on to keys. So when you think about this problem, don't really focus on all the arguments about encryption and freedom of speech and all these kind of things. From a technical perspective, it's going to come down to key management.
Now, is there a jurisdictional issue there? Do you think, given that Privacy Shield, the replacement for Safe Harbor, may or may not make it through. And having talked to Max Schrems at the Night Talk yesterday, I suspect it may get an identical legal challenge headed to it very quickly. Are hosting providers operating in Europe going to have to do that kind of key escrow?
Well, we don't know what the US is going to come up with, right?
Well, no, but France and Austria already have essentially warrantless wiretapping laws on the books.
I think that's actually one of the more interesting things is you're positioning it as the US and Europe. Within Europe, there's disagreement, right? There are spectrums of thought about this. Britain, currently still in Europe, has one sort of view on it, and I think that the Germans are probably the most extreme in terms of this thinking around privacy and encryption. So in terms of jurisdiction, I think there's actually a Europe-wide problem as well as a US issue. When it comes down to it, I mean, economics tends to win, and that's why we have Europe, right, as an entity for economic reasons. And so I think that we will end up making an economic agreement, with the United States about how this works. It's very hard to see what the agreement is going to be at this point.
We've had talk of national clouds on the stage. There was the discussion with Luxembourg folks yesterday about are we going to have isolated sections? Are we going to have companies that only do business in one country, realizing, as happens with regulation sometimes, that it's probably not worth the effort to try and expand internationally until they're sure they can do it on a big scale?
So I think when you have to untangle two things when you're talking about national security policies and clouds and all this kind of things, is whether that's actually a technical argument about data privacy or it's a cover story for some sort of protectionism. It's to say, well, okay, look, we're going to say you can't do that outside of my country, and then in fact it's to keep a local economy going. I think that the big question will be around data sovereignty, which is where things are. So, for example, CloudFlare, which is obviously a US company, although operates genuinely worldwide, including inside China, which is quite tricky. We are building a new data center in Europe, which will not be used by our customers, but will be used by our logging infrastructure, because we have error logs and all that kind of stuff. Well, those error logs can contain private, in quote, information, depending on your definition of privacy. Your IP address, for example, might be in one of our error logs saying something went wrong. We don't keep that data for very long, but we can see the day where the European Union says, actually a visitor from Europe, or even within a country, a visitor inside Germany, no information about them must leave the country. So we're actually building a second logging data center here.
What do you think is going to be the harshest restriction from the perspective of the cloud providers and the hosting providers? What can you see realistically as being the hardest regulatory requirement that's going to come in the next few years for them in any of the countries going around? And that might include China or anywhere like that.
So I think, China always sounds scary, but in some ways is less scary than Europe, because we actually live in Europe and have to live under those laws. So it's easier to talk about China, because it's far away. I think that what you've seen in the UK with the bill that's currently trying to go through Parliament is requirements for service providers to keep essentially logging information about who's contacting which websites. Now, we can ignore all the arguments about how crazy it is to try and do that, and as if visiting a website tells you much about what you did on that website. But there'll be some sort of logging requirement, and perhaps probably the worst case would be that there is a requirement to keep keys and some sort of system for storing keys and relating them to customers. John made a connection to this website with this cryptographic key. Keep a copy of the key in case I did something bad.
Do you think there's I am seeing in 5-10 years' time, because government IT products, that at some point there's going to be a database breach in there. If you have that logging infrastructure required, how safe can you keep it?
Well, that's one of the arguments, right? Which is why service providers, companies like Cloudflare don't want to keep information. One of the reasons why we ditch our logs every 24 hours is that there isn't stuff to steal, right? The less stuff there is to break into and get, the better. And one of the arguments why companies want to use strong encryption is to say, well, if I can encrypt the information and I don't have the key, in which public key cryptography gives us that possibility, right? Then that information is only available to my customer, then I'm in a safer place, because if somebody breaks in and steals my database, well, it's just a blob of bits at that point. So I think that this key management thing becomes a real issue, and I think that hopefully we will get to a point where I'm hopeful that what will happen is we'll have an agreement, which is that it's okay for people to encrypt things and not be able to decrypt them.
Stuart Baker from the NSA was on stage a couple of days ago, and he made the point that, talking specifically about Apple's encryption, their idea that they should not hold these keys. They should choose, ideally, to do zero-knowledge encryption. Mm-hmm. That it was more about pragmatism and economics than it was about actually wanting to take a stand, that they are taking a stand because they can sell that in the US, despite the fact they are not taking that stand with the Chinese government. Would you agree with that? Would you say that it's pragmatism on their part, or is this them changing their mind and saying, with what we know now, this is how it should be?
Well, I think that, I can't read Tim Cook's mind about what he's doing. I think if you were to stop in this room for 60 seconds and people were to look at their mobile phone and think about what's in their mobile phone quietly and just ponder the idea that I've got access to your mobile phone, or someone else has who's malicious, then what you realize is that within those devices, we're now carrying around our lives. Right, so if you take my phone and you can hack into it, then you've got access to all my communications, you've got access to banking information, you've got access to private communications with my family. And I think that maybe it plays well in the US, what Apple is doing, but I think actually anyone who stops and thinks about that will realize that safeguarding that data is very, very important. So Apple's stand, maybe it's pragmatic, maybe it's principled, but I think it's important because stuff gets broken into, and we don't want that to happen.
I want to pick up on a point you made in there, which is that your phone contains essentially access to your entire life, history, thoughts, notes, everything like that. And one of the debates is whether access to someone's phone, just in the idea of getting that access, even through a legal warrant, is an overstep, is too much access for a warrant. Would you say there should be, let's say in an ideal world, someone, I'm fairly sure it's mathematically impossible, but someone invents a form of encryption where you can have a safe key escrow. I realize that's a fantasy land, but let's say thought experiment.
Well, it's a crazy thought experiment, right? I mean, if you say you've got key escrow, there's a key somewhere else, are you saying you can safeguard that? I mean, look at the data breaches in the US or in Europe. I mean, this comes down to, are we going to allow companies to not hold encryption keys? That I think it ultimately comes down to that, which is it going to be okay for Apple to say, we don't have the key, because they don't have the key?
Well, no, I want to draw you on the philosophical point there, which is, would you say that there should be, in an ideal world, a warrant process for access to someone's phone, or is that too much?
So I don't personally believe there should be a warrant process that forces a service provider like Apple or somebody else to have made their product weaker. That's really what I think. I think if that, now, is that the same thing as this warrant? I mean, because when you're talking about this warrant process, if Apple doesn't have access to my iPhone, then you can serve them with a warrant. They can't do anything. So when you're making this argument, what you're really arguing about is it okay for someone to sell a product that they don't have access to?
I'd say that's a separate argument. This is more on the philosophical thing. There is so much information of phones, so much, just from a personal point of view. Should there be again, this is the US argument, this is President Obama's argument, that there should be a way to get access to that data, or is that too personal?
What you're talking about there is a security vulnerability in my phone.
Right.
Right? I mean, you're saying, should there be a government-mandated vulnerability? And I think that's a mistake to do that. I think that weakens the security of the device, and that device is carrying my life around in it. Now, let's put myself in the shoes of an intelligence agency that wants to get access to my phone. A few years ago, there was online in the UK, GCHQ, which is a bit like the NSA, they have these online competitions. And there was a very interesting competition which was trying to get people to apply for jobs. And what was very obvious if you did it was this competition was not about code breaking. What it was about exploiting software. It was about breaking into software. It was about finding vulnerabilities. So, I think that intelligence agencies, that's what they will do. They will say, right, well, we can't, the encryption is a problem. John's phone, I'm going to subvert it in some other way. I'm going to look for a vulnerability. Now, if you think about that for a minute, you don't want Apple to build in vulnerabilities like that because someone else will go looking for that. So there's a tension here between, you want the intelligence agency to get in, but it shouldn't be too easy because you want them to only use it in a situation where there's a national interest.
Right. Let's play a hypothetical, because we asked this at the night talk last night. Let's go for the worst case scenario as far as privacy advocates are concerned. Let's say that 2017 there is a terrorist attack on American soil, and President Trump signs into law a warrantless wiretapping, backdoors required law. Do hosting providers stay in the US? Do they have to? Does that break everything? Or is there a way that in that worst case scenario you could still have a business that survives in the US and the EU at the same time?
Did he digitally sign that law?
Almost certainly not.
So, because if he did, then maybe there was a backdoor in that encryption, in which case I can probably fix that law, right? Because there's probably a vulnerability in it.
And sadly, that's just Estonia.
Yes, I actually have an Estonian ID. I have one of those ID cards, and so I have actually signed one thing, which was a tweet using it. So, what would happen? You mean what would happen if the US said, there are these, Yeah,
if you want to do business in the US, you have to log everything, you have to put a backdoor in everything, you have to allow us access, and you're going to jail if you don't.
Well, the US has done things like that before, right? Doing business with Cuba and things like that have been things. So that law could be made, and there could be, a jurisdictional issue. Now, all of this is, I'm not a lawyer, so you're now talking about international law, which is not my expertise, but I think that's a worrying scenario. What I'm hopeful of is a second Clinton administration, and in this Clinton administration, they make the same decision they made 22 years ago, which is to say, we think that there are downsides to everyone having strong encryption, but that the benefits to a greater society outweighs it.
That's lovely, but that is a dodge of the question.
No, I didn't.
That's
I
the
said,
possible alternative.
No. The answer is that I'm not an expert in international law, but it's quite plausible that if the US tried to force this, they could have a go, and we could have a problem.
So, what would be your advice as we come to just the last few minutes of the talk? If you were to advise the folks out here on how to get through the next few years, as we have everything with Privacy Shield, with Safe Harbor being killed, with whatever will replace Privacy Shield if it dies. How do you navigate that? How do you make sure that your business and the dollars and cents and euros that you are taking in don't fall apart when the contracts don't get renewed? How do you work through that?
I do wish the European Union wouldn't call it Privacy Shield because it sounds like a Norton product that I don't want to buy. But that's something that people are going to have to keep an eye on because that's actually being discussed right now and understand what the agreement is. I suspect something will get ratified and there'll be an agreement where data can move around. Because one of the issues about it was, well, we don't want data to be in the US because the US can get hold of it. But if you go back and you look at the stuff that Snowden put out, the US was tapping the actual fiber around the world. So it wasn't actually in the US necessarily, right? But I think that'll get agreed on. I think that the other thing that's happening is that for hosting providers, separate from all this privacy stuff, is that encryption is being demanded by the public. And for a couple of reasons. One is the Snowden effect, if there is one. The other one is that Google is ranking secure websites higher than insecure websites. So you know what? People who are hosting stuff are going to get demand for HTTPS.
We also had someone on stage the other day who pointed out that Google is now flagging up insecure email transfers.
Yep. So there's going to be lots and lots and lots of encryption. And so I go back to what I said earlier, which is what we don't know is what's going to happen with the key management. Are people going to be forced to keep keys around so that things can be encrypted and decrypted when there's a warrant?
Ladies and gentlemen, John Graham-Cumming is from CloudFlare. Where can they see you and your team later?
We have a booth over there.
Over there somewhere.
Over there somewhere. In the cloud, obviously. But I think there's a physical presence too.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I get an enormous round of applause, please, for John Graham-Cumming?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.